In November 1971, a group of 6 school pupils and 2 adults headed into the Cairngorms. Not all of them would survive the planned 2-day expedition. The party of students from Edinburgh's Ainsley Park School were staying at the Lagan Lea Outdoor Learning Centre at Kincraig, some 8 miles from Aviemore, in the heart of the Scottish Highlands. In all, there were 14 of them, all under the supervision of Ben Beattie, the school's 23-year-old instructor for outdoor activities. Although he had a mountain instructor certificate, he was not very well experienced in winter-like conditions. Also on the expedition was his girlfriend, 21-year-old Catherine Davidson. From the Lagan Lea Centre was trainee instructor, 18-year-old Sheila Sutherland. On Saturday 20th November, the students and the instructors set off on a navigational expedition that was expected to take the 2 days. They were heading for the Cairngorm Plateau from Cairngorm itself to Ben Macdui. By the time they left base, it was already 11 o'clock in the morning. Due to this, they used the ski lift to be closer to the plateau, and when they reached it, they were split into 2 groups. Those with more experience were led by Beattie, while Davidson and Sutherland led the other one, which followed on behind. Both groups were to head to the Curragh Bothy at a lower level in the Larrig Roo, where they would spend the night once sun went down at 4 o'clock. The less experienced group were to return via the Larrig Roo, while the others would cross Cairntoul and Bray Riach. They were told that in an emergency they were to head to the Curran shelter, a very basic shelter, but good enough to survive bad weather, which had been given the go-ahead by John Paisley, head of Lagan Lea. Not long after they set off, however, the weather deteriorated. The group, led by Beattie, made it to the Curran shelter as the whiteout worsened. Davidson, however, believed that due to the conditions, the second group wouldn't be able to find it, so decided to lead them to a slight hollow at the head of Faith Buig Burn, around 460 metres or 500 yards from the Curran shelter, east of Lochan Buig. Davidson instructed the group to bivouac when she thought they were near the place, but with the burn being completely covered in snow, she actually had chosen the place where there was a larger accumulation of snow. When they didn't arrive, Beattie wasn't worried, as he presumed they'd found shelter somewhere else. The children placed their sleeping bags in the bivouac sacks, known as bivvy bags, and settled behind a wall of snow they'd built up for protection against the poor conditions. Their spirits were good until the weather became even worse as the snow continued to fall overnight, and panic began to set in that they would be suffocated by it. The following morning at daybreak, a boy's voice could be heard shouting from beneath the snow. Davidson and another boy set off to help, but were forced back due to the atrocious weather. Meanwhile, Beattie's group had spent the night in the Curran shelter and had to dig their way out of it on the Sunday. It was difficult, but they managed to make their way to Rothimarcus hut, where they phoned Lagan Lea. At 5:30 that afternoon, the children were picked up in their transport and taken back to the centre. Meanwhile, Beattie and Paisley drove to the ski centre to see if there was any news of the other group. There wasn't. They then headed to the Glenmore Lodge and on to Aviemore Police Station, where they reported Davidson, Sutherland and their party as missing. It was 7 o'clock at night. A party of rescuers was sent out from Glenmore Lodge, and Cairngorm Mountain Rescue Team, along with mountain rescue teams from RAF Kinloss, Braemar and Aberdeen, prepared to search as soon as they could on the Monday morning before dawn. Although they shouted for help and could see flares that evening, the shouts from the Davidson group were unheard by the search party due to the conditions. Their own flares had been lost in the snow. Overnight, the condition of the party deteriorated. Some of the children were delirious with hypothermia, and in fact were dying. On the Monday morning, the 22nd of November, Davidson set off to get help. At around 10:30 that morning, she was spotted by one of the helicopters, but the conditions made it difficult for the pilot from RAF Lookers to try and lift her. He ended up flying to the Glenmore Lodge, and he and his team were ordered to do airborne checks on various shelters that were mapped. When they reached the current shelter, there was no sign of anyone, and they were about to turn back to the lodge when one of them spotted something red. They thought it was a tent. On approach, they soon realised it was a person on their hands and knees. It was Davidson. However, her legs were locked in position, which made it impossible for her to be carried to the plane. The helicopter tried to get closer, but the downdraft was simply making conditions worse, so one of the crew jumped out, but no one else could be seen. She was airlifted to Aviemore, and when in the ambulance, managed to tell the rescuers where the rest of her party were. However, she was in a bad way. The hypothermia was advanced, and her hands were frozen solid. She could barely speak. The weather began to close in once more. With the cloud base so low, helicopters were useless, so search teams set off on foot. When they reached the area where the children and Sutherland were, the snow was waist deep. 6 children and the assistant were dug out. They had all succumbed to the weather and had died, except for the last person pulled out. This was Raymond Leslie. He was still breathing and was attended to by a doctor from the Braemar Mountain Rescue Team. At 3 o'clock, he was airlifted by an RAF Sea King helicopter, and both he and Davidson were flown to Raigmore Hospital in Inverness. Both of them recovered from their ordeal. The victims had to stay on the mountain until the following day, when the weather cleared enough for them to be brought off. They were Carol Bertram, Susan Byrne, Diane Dudgeon, Lorraine Dick, and William Kerr, along with the trainee instructor, Sheila Sutherland. A memorial service for the dead was held at Inch Parish Church on 28th November. In 1972, a fatal accident inquiry was held in Banff, where it was found that on the letters of parental consent it didn't mention anything about winter mountaineering, and only one of the parents knew they were heading to the Cairngorms. Their deaths were recorded as being due to cold and exposure. The inquiry made several recommendations, including fitness and training for such expeditions, closer liaison with parents, and that fully qualified instructors and certified teachers should be the ones to be on these kind of outings. In the end, the inquiry found that no one was at fault, although many parents wanted the blame to be firmly placed with Beattie and Paisley. One of the recommendations was to remove the higher level bothies, and after much argument, these were indeed later removed. John Duff, leader of the Braemar Mountain Rescue Team, later said that Davidson's decision to hunker down where she did was a mistake. He was quoted as saying, "To attempt a weather bivouac in a storm on the Cairngorms Plateau is literally a life or death decision and a last option." He believed the expedition was overambitious for teenagers and blamed those who took the decisions both in the planning process and the execution of the expedition. Laganlia is operated by the City of Edinburgh Council's Sport and Outdoor Learning Unit and remains popular in the teaching of outdoor pursuits. To date, the Cairngorm Plateau tragedy is Scotland's and the UK's worst mountaineering incident.